Okay, welcome to this lecture on how are there so many species of tropical trees. I'll read some of this. I started to do my handwritten lecture, which I've done in class. I ended up writing up a number of things on here. So in this unit, we'll consider the maintenance of tropical tree diversity. And that is to say, in the answer to why are there so many species coexisting in tropical forests, we will use an ecological approach to explain why don't more trees go extinct due to competitive exclusion. So again, the whole big question is here, if you have in a single hectare, which is 2 football fields of forest, you have 300 species. If in 50 hectares you have several thousand species, how do all those species of trees coexist? And that is that if you just allow ecological interactions, we should see some of them driving others out. Note that previously, I guess I'll go ahead and add a little bit of this. Previously, we discussed the role of allopatric speciation in driving species diversity. That's an evolutionary explanation. An ecological explanation deals with the maintenance of diversity. That is the prevention of extinction, not the formation of new species. That is the realm of genetics and the realm of evolutionary processes over long periods of time. What we're really dealing with today is ecological interactions. This is an important distinction. Yes, it is. For this unit, we hold speciation constant and examine the interactions that lead to extinction or coexistence. Recall that a niche is the n-dimensional hypervolume, the axes of which describe the environmental factors required by a species for survival and reproduction. So one axis might be soil granularity, one might be nitrogen availability, one might be phosphorus availability, one might be water, one might be sunlight. Each of those would be a different axis, right? And then remember the competitive exclusion principle. No two species can occupy the same niche indefinitely. One will drive the other to extinction. And certainly remember this from 208. But this effectively is the foundation of what we call classical niche theory. And classical niche theory would explain tropical tree diversity very easily. It would say that species are specialized into niches, a process we call niche partitioning or resource partitioning, which are the same thing, and thus they aren't competing and they coexist. Competitive exclusion principle, CEP, does not drive species to extinction because specialization has reduced the competition. In your text, you will read of the paradox of the plankton, where Hutchinson talks about just this problem. There are all these algae species in the ocean. They require the same resources, the same things to survive, but there are so many species. How do they coexist? Why don't some of them drive others to extinction? They shouldn't exist together, but they do. In the rainforest, many tree species coexist. Why? Is it the paradox of the plankton or is it classical niche theory? So here's where we go. I wanted to draw out for you what I did in class, a very brief sort of experimental look at this. This is a little bit different than what I did in class in a way it's actually better. So I'm going to have 3 different soil types. Soil A, soil B, and soil C. And in my little experiment, I'm going to assume that I'm going to have 3 different species of tree. Species 1, 2, and 3, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 1, and 2, and 3. And tree species 1, 2, and 3 are each specialists on a soil type. So in the event that it is the case that if species 1 likes type A, species 2 likes type B, and species 3 likes type C, right? Then if we make what we call a common garden experiment and we put the seeds of each of those species into each of these soil types, what will we see happen over time? And over time, what we should see over time with seeds of all three species, so seeds of all species on every soil, what will the mature trees look like? What will the mature composition be? And you might be able to imagine that according to niche theory, if in fact they are specialists on each of these things, we should see species 1 on soil A, species 2 on soil B, and species 3 on C, and the other ones should be outcompeted as a result of competitive exclusion. Right? And as a result, the outcome would be a group of trees such that only species 1 is on soil A, species 2 is on soil B. This is an extinction structured community. Right? It's due to this competition and things being driven to extinction on each soil type that caused this pattern. This has a couple of predictions or patterns that come from it. If this is true, then we can say that soil type should predict species composition. We can also predict that tree niches are narrow, specialized, and they should be distinct or unique among the different species of trees. So those are a couple things going on here. So we would expect that if there are a lot of species of trees in the Amazon, there should be a lot of different kinds of soil. I'll talk for a moment about ways in which we might expect trees to partition resources in tropical rainforest. And we've talked about soils, you could talk about nutrients, but one way that has come up in our structure of tropical forest is the idea that there may be gaps in the forest, and it may be that lots of sunlight can come into the gap, and that sunlight is 100% at the top of the forest. It's 1% at the bottom of the forest, and in the gap, it's lots of sunlight here. If this is the case, the researchers that propose that light regime, as we call it, is the important environmental factor for trees, then we would expect there to be gap specialists, and we would expect there to be forest or understory specialists. And these have, it's hot, there's lots of light, and of course in the forest understory there's little light. Now, as what we know about succession and this process, right, is this directional change in species composition that occurs as a result of maturation. I'm just going to shortcut to the term maturation here. And essentially, in a lot of habitats, we know that you might begin, if you have a fire, where the tall trees that were here get burned to the ground by a fire. You might start with grasses. From grasses, you might move to shrubs. From shrubs, you might have small trees that grow up. And small trees might be outgrown by slightly larger trees, and then those larger trees might be outgrown by larger trees still. So this process here of succession occurs largely as a result of each species changing the environment that it's in and making that environment different so that other species actually outcompete the earlier stages. So one of the things that we see are that the species that are early species, we often call pioneers. And pioneer species share some characteristics. They often have good dispersal, like fireweed, or wind blown, like a dandelion. They often grow fast because they're taking advantage of an opportunity. They're short-lived because they essentially bloom and make seeds very, very quickly. And they're often what we say poorly defended. That means chemically. Their approach to solving the problem of reproduction is to get to reproductive age quickly before they get eaten or otherwise broken down. The other group of species we would call climax species, which tend to be have larger seeds, and I'm contrasting that a little bit to the good dispersal. So at least they do have larger seeds. They may be usually not that great at dispersal. Okay, they tend to be slow growing. They are long lived, and they're well defended chemically. Because their strategy, more or less, is to carefully invest lots of chemicals in their leaves and defend themselves so they can live a long period of time. These species that are pioneer species are what we call R-selected species, which means that their high growth rate, R, is how they survive. And these are K-selected, which means their ability to compete at carrying capacity is how they survive. And so each specializes in a different stage of succession. So apply this specialization, if you will, it's a life history strategy, or a life history strategy, to the gap that we were just talking about up here. And what we might see is that in gaps, we would have these R-selected species. But over time, the gap will mature, and we will get K-selected species. Right? So essentially, your gap, as you might imagine it, would start like a big hole in the forest where a tree has fallen down. It would begin with shrubs and little things, and then bigger trees would grow in here, and then those trees would compete, and eventually you'd have, again, giant canopy trees. So this process would be the process of gap regeneration. It's often called gap succession. I'll put it in there, Succession, gap succession. And the hypothesis that has reigned supreme for a number of years is that tropical forest tree diversity is maintained by what we call gap dynamics. And that means that when gaps are formed, gaps open new resources of light, right? And that means that our selected species exist there. And they won't be competing with the K-selected species at that time because they're using this high light environment. And the K-selected species, they exist in the climax forest. But that forest is so short-lived in the tropics, it is proposed that it quickly becomes a gap forest. So that constantly you're breaking into the forest with these gap structures that are breaking down this otherwise climax forest in a relatively short period of time. So, gap theory, gap dynamics, plus classical niche theory equals coexistence of tree species that utilize different levels of light. And because the tropical forest is constantly creating gaps, we're constantly forming small, medium, and large gaps, right? Some as big as a football field, some only as big as our lecture hall, and some only as big as a single branch, right? So small would be like a branch, this would be like a tree, and this would be like more than 5 trees, right? So, and you have these different size gaps, which creating different light regimes and creates different habitats. So essentially, this allows all of our trees to coexist. This is one explanation for tropical diversity. We're going to look at the data and see what we can find that supports this explanation, this hypothesis. Of course, we're also going to propose some other hypotheses, so get ready for those.